I knew we didn't belong the moment the room went quiet. It wasn't loud at first, just a subtle shift, like the air changed its mind about letting us stay. Like every conversation softened half a note when I stepped inside holding my daughter's hand. Her small fingers wrapped around mine like I was the only safe thing in a world that had never been kind to us. And maybe that was already the problem. The restaurant smelled like expensive wine and polished wood, the kind of place where people didn't look at prices, where the lighting was low enough to hide flaws but bright enough to show status. And I felt every inch of myself underdressed, even though I'd spent 20 minutes in the mirror trying to look like I belonged, smoothing down my hair, adjusting the only decent blouse I owned, telling myself tonight mattered because she had asked for it, because my little girl had whispered earlier, "Mom, can we go somewhere nice just once?" And I had said yes before thinking about what that really meant. The hostess looked at me the way people do when they've already made a decision, her smile tight, professional, practiced, but not real, her eyes flicking down to my worn flats, then to my daughter's jacket that was a size too big because kids grow faster than paychecks, and then back to my face like she was trying to place me somewhere that made sense, and when she couldn't, she chose the easiest answer. "I'm sorry, we're fully booked tonight." Her voice was smooth, rehearsed, but I could see it, the hesitation, the lie hanging just beneath the surface, because behind her, just past her shoulder, I could see empty tables, perfectly set, waiting for someone else, someone more acceptable, someone who didn't look like they counted every dollar before walking through the door. My daughter tugged gently at my hand. "Mom, did we do something wrong?" The question hit harder than anything else could have, quiet and confused and too familiar for someone her age, and I felt something in my chest tighten, not anger, not yet, just that old, familiar weight of knowing exactly what this moment was and how it always ended. I knelt down in front of her, smoothing a strand of hair behind her ear, forcing a small smile that I hoped looked real enough for her to believe. "No, sweetheart," I whispered, steady, calm, the way I always tried to be. "We don't stay where we're not respected." I stood up before the hostess could say anything else, before anyone could offer a half-hearted excuse or a delayed correction, because I'd learned a long time ago that dignity isn't something people hand to you. It's something you choose to keep, even when it would be easier to argue, to beg, to make them see you. And as I turned toward the door, I could feel it again, that shift in the room, heavier now, sharper, like something had just changed, like someone else had started paying attention. And I didn't know it yet, but that was the moment everything stopped being small, because somewhere behind me, a man who didn't speak unless it mattered had just decided that what happened next wasn't up to them anymore. I had almost reached the door when a voice behind me cut clean through the low hum of the room, not loud, not raised, but precise in a way that made everything else feel like background noise. "Why is that table empty?" I stopped without meaning to, my hand still wrapped around the cold metal of the door handle, and something in my chest told me not to turn around yet, not to look, because whatever was happening behind me had nothing to do with people like me. Not usually, not ever. The hostess hesitated. I could hear it in the silence that followed, in the way her heels shifted slightly against the marble floor as she searched for the right answer, the acceptable answer, the safe answer. "Sir, it is reserved," she said finally, her voice tighter now, less confident, like she was suddenly aware that this conversation mattered more than the last one. There was a pause, short but heavy, the kind that stretches just enough to make people uncomfortable, and then the same voice again, calm, controlled, but edged with something I could not quite name. "For who?" Another pause, longer this time, and I could feel it ripple through the room, subtle but undeniable, conversation slowing, eyes shifting, attention redirecting towards something unseen but important. I turned then, just slightly, enough to see him without making it obvious, and that was when I understood why the air had changed. He was sitting near the center of the room, not hidden, not trying to be, but everything about him made space around him feel intentional, like even the furniture knew where it was supposed to be in relation to him. His suit was perfectly tailored, dark and sharp against the warm lighting, his posture relaxed but deliberate, one hand resting near a glass he had not touched in a while, as if whatever he was thinking mattered more than anything in front of him. His eyes were on the hostess, steady, unreadable, and suddenly she looked smaller, uncertain in a way she had not been with me. "I can check on that for you," she said quickly. already stepping back, already trying to fix something she had not believed needed fixing just seconds ago. "No," he replied, and the single word landed with a weight that made my grip tighten on my daughter's hand. "You can answer now." The manager appeared almost instantly, like he had been waiting for a reason to step in, his smile wide but strained, the kind that exists only to smooth over problems before they grow teeth. "Sir, is there an issue?" he asked, his tone respectful in a way that felt practiced, familiar, and I realized then that whoever this man was, he was not someone people said no to twice. The man did not look at the manager right away, his gaze shifting instead, slow and deliberate, until it landed on me, and for a moment, just a moment, it felt like the entire room disappeared, like it was just that look and everything it carried, something sharp, observant, and strangely certain. "Yes," he said quietly, still looking at me, "there is." The manager followed his gaze, confusion flickering across his face before recognition replaced it. And then something else, something closer to concern. "Sir, she was just leaving," he said quickly, like that explained everything, like that made it acceptable. The man's expression did not change, but something about the silence that followed made the room feel smaller, tighter, like it was holding its breath. "That is not what I asked," he said. And this time, there was no mistaking it. The shift from conversation to something else entirely, something that made even the polished confidence of the manager falter just enough to be noticed. And standing there, halfway between staying and leaving, I realized with a clarity that felt almost unreal that this moment was no longer about a table, or a reservation, or whether we belonged. It was about something bigger, something I did not understand yet, but could already feel pulling everything in a direction none of them had expected. The manager's smile broke first, just for a second, but it was enough for me to see that whatever confidence he had walked over with was starting to slip, like he was suddenly aware that he had stepped into something he did not control. "Sir, there must be some misunderstanding," he said, his voice still polite but tighter now, carefully measured, like each word had to pass inspection before leaving his mouth. "We simply informed the guest that we are at capacity tonight." The man did not respond right away, and that silence did more than any raised voice ever could, stretching across the room, settling into the spaces between people, making even the clink of glassware feel too loud. His gaze shifted again, this time fully to me, steady and unhurried, like he was taking in details no one else bothered to notice, and I felt it, that strange awareness of being seen without being judged, which somehow felt more unsettling than anything else that had happened so far. "At capacity," he repeated quietly, as if testing the words, weighing them, and then his eyes moved past me, back to the hostess, to the empty tables, to the carefully arranged perfection that had just minutes ago excluded us without hesitation. "Then explain the empty seats." The manager followed his line of sight, and this time there was no smooth recovery, no immediate answer, just a brief flicker of panic that he tried to hide behind professionalism. "Those are reserved for our priority guests," he said, a little faster now, like speed could make it sound more reasonable. "We maintain a certain standard of experience." I felt my daughter's fingers tighten around mine, small but firm, and I knew she could feel it too. The shift, the tension, the invisible line that had been drawn without anyone saying it out loud. The man leaned back slightly in his chair, not relaxed, not casual, but controlled in a way that made the movement feel deliberate. "And she does not meet that standard?" he asked, his tone unchanged, but the question landed differently, sharper and possible. To soften. The manager hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to answer everything without saying a word. "That is not what I meant," he corrected quickly, but the damage was already done, hanging in the air for everyone close enough to hear. The man's gaze returned to me again, and this time there was something else there, something quieter, more intentional, like he had already made a decision and was simply allowing it to unfold. "You are leaving," he said, not as a question, not even directly to me, more like an observation spoken out loud. I swallowed, suddenly aware of how many eyes were on us now, how the room that had ignored us before was now watching every movement like it mattered. "We were told there is no space," I replied, my voice steady despite everything, because that was one thing I refused to lose, not here, not in front of my daughter. He studied me for a moment longer, and then something shifted, subtle but absolute, like a line had been crossed that could not be undone. He reached for the glass in front of him, not to drink, just to move it slightly to the side, clearing space in front of him like he was preparing for something else. "There is space," he said calmly, his eyes never leaving mine. "They simply decided it was not for you." The room went completely still, and in that silence, I understood something I had not expected. This was no longer about whether we belonged. It was about who decided that. And for the first time since we walked in, it felt like that decision had just been taken away from the people who thought they owned it. The manager opened his mouth again, but this time nothing came out right away, like the words he had relied on all evening suddenly refused to cooperate. And I could see it, the calculation behind his eyes, the quick attempt to figure out who this man was and why the rules seemed to bend around him without effort. "Sir, if there has been any misunderstanding, we can certainly accommodate," he said finally, his tone shifting, softer now, almost careful, like he was stepping onto unfamiliar ground. The hostess stood frozen beside him, her earlier confidence gone, replaced with something quieter, something closer to concern. And for the first time since we walked in, I was no longer the one being evaluated. The man did not acknowledge the change immediately, did not reward it, and that made it feel even more significant, like approval was something earned, not given. "You already decided," he said simply, his voice even, controlled. "Do not change your standards because I asked a question." The words landed differently than I expected, not protective in the way I had imagined, not rushed or emotional, but deliberate, like he was correcting something larger than just this moment. The manager swallowed, his posture adjusting slightly, shoulders straightening as he tried to regain control of the situation that was slipping further from his hands with every second. "We want all of our guests to feel welcome," he replied, though the statement sounded weaker now, like it no longer held the same weight it had just minutes ago. My daughter shifted beside me, leaning slightly closer, and I felt her presence anchor me, remind me why I had walked in here in the first place, why leaving had felt easier than staying, and why standing here now felt different in a way I could not fully explain. The man's gaze flicked briefly toward her, just a second, but something in his expression changed, softened almost imperceptibly, before returning to the manager. "Then act like it," he said, and there was no sharpness in his tone, no raised volume, just certainty, the kind that does not need to prove itself. The room seemed to exhale all at once, the tension shifting again, not gone, but redirected, and I realized that whatever had just happened was no longer about convincing anyone of anything. It was about revealing what had already been true all along. The manager nodded quickly, too quickly, like he was eager to move forward, to fix, to restore balance. "Of course," he said, turning toward me now, his smile returning but not quite reaching his eyes. "We would be happy to prepare a table for you immediately." I hesitated, not because I wanted to refuse, not because I did not understand what was being offered, but because something inside me resisted the sudden change, the way respect appeared only after someone else had demanded it on my behalf. I looked down at my daughter, her eyes wide, hopeful in a way that made my chest tighten again, and I knew this was not about pride anymore, not entirely. It was about her, about what she would remember from tonight. "Mom," she whispered softly, and I squeezed her hand gently, grounding both of us in that single moment. When I looked back up, the man was still watching, not expectant, not impatient, just present, like he was allowing me the space to choose without pressure, and that, more than anything else, made the decision feel like mine again. "Thank you," I said quietly, my voice steady, not to the manager, not even fully to the man, but to the moment itself, to the shift I could feel settling into place. And as the hostess hurried to lead us toward one of those empty tables that had never truly been unavailable, I realized something that stayed with me longer than the lights, the music, or the polished surfaces ever could. Respect that arrives only when demanded still reveals who people are when no one is watching. And tonight, someone had made sure that truth did not stay hidden. The table felt different the moment we sat down, not because of the white tablecloth or the perfectly aligned silverware, but because of how quickly everything had changed, how the same space that had quietly rejected us minutes ago now seemed almost eager to prove it had never done that at all. and I could feel it in the way the hostess pulled out the chair for my daughter with careful hands, in the way her voice softened when she asked if we needed anything, in the way no one questioned whether we belonged anymore. My daughter climbed into her seat, her eyes wide as she looked around, taking in the soft lights, the neatly folded napkins, the small glass candle flickering between us like something out of a story she had only seen in movies. "Mom, this is really nice," she whispered, her voice filled with something fragile, something hopeful, and I nodded, even though part of me was still catching up to the moment, still trying to understand how quickly the world could shift when the right person decided it should. I reached for the menu, but before I could open it, a server appeared, not the one from before, someone new, someone more composed, more attentive, as if the entire staff had quietly rearranged itself around us. "Good evening," he said, his tone respectful, steady. "My name is Daniel, and I will be taking care of you tonight." Taking care of us. The phrase lingered longer than it should have. Simple words that somehow felt heavier than the ones that had turned us away earlier. I nodded politely, aware of how my daughter watched everything, absorbing it, learning from it, and I wanted this to be something she remembered for the right reasons. "Thank you," I said, keeping my voice even, not overly grateful, not apologetic, just present. He handed us menus, offering recommendations we had not asked for, describing dishes in a way that made them sound like experiences rather than meals, and for a moment, I let myself follow along, let myself imagine that this was normal, that we had always been allowed to sit here without question. But even as I listened, I could feel it, the awareness lingering just beyond the edge of the table, the quiet presence that had made all of this possible, and without meaning to, I glanced across the room. He was still there, in the same seat, unchanged, as if nothing about his world had shifted at all, and yet everything around him had. He was no longer looking directly at us. His attention seemingly returned to whatever had occupied him before, but there was something about the stillness in his posture, the way his hand rested lightly against the edge of the table, that made it clear he was still aware, still in control of a situation that no longer needed words. My daughter followed my gaze, curious, and then leaned closer to me. "Is that the man who helped us?" she asked softly, her voice careful, like she already understood that some questions should not be too loud. I hesitated for a second, not because I did not know the answer, but because I was not sure how to explain something like that to a child, how to describe a moment where power had stepped in quietly and changed the outcome without asking for anything in return. "He noticed," I said finally, choosing the simplest truth I could offer, and she nodded, as if that was enough, as if being noticed was already something important. The food arrived sooner than expected, plates placed carefully in front of us, every detail precise, every movement intentional. And as my daughter's face lit up at the sight of it, I felt something settle inside me, something steady, something that had nothing to do with the room or the people in it. But even then, even in that small moment of calm, I understood something I had not expected when I walked through those doors. This was not just about being given a table, it was about being seen when it mattered, and across the room. Without looking at him directly, I knew he understood that better than anyone here. Halfway through the meal, I realized something else had changed, not just how we were being treated, but how everyone else was behaving around us. Like an invisible line had been drawn that no one wanted to cross anymore, and it showed in small ways, in the lowered voices from nearby tables, in the way the staff moved with a little more precision, a little more caution, as if the entire room had quietly agreed to pay attention to something it had ignored before. My daughter was smiling now, fully, the kind of smile that made everything else fade for a moment, her earlier question forgotten as she focused on the plate in front of her, carefully cutting her food the way she had practiced at home, trying to do everything right, and I let myself breathe a little easier watching her, letting that simple happiness ground me in the present instead of everything that had led up to it. "Mom, this is the best place ever," she said softly, leaning forward like she was sharing a secret, and I smiled back, nodding, even though part of me knew that what made this moment special had very little to do with the place itself. I reached for my glass of water, but before I could take a sip, I noticed the manager again, standing a few feet away, speaking in a low voice with one of the servers, his expression tight, controlled, but not calm, not entirely, and every few seconds, His eyes flicked toward the man across the room, like he was waiting for something. Approval, perhaps, or permission to move forward. I followed his gaze again, slower this time, more deliberate, and found him exactly where he had been, unchanged, composed. But now he was looking at something else, a phone resting on the table in front of him, his attention briefly shifting as he read something that had just appeared on the screen. There was no urgency in the movement, no visible reaction, but the moment felt different anyway, like something had just been set in motion beyond what any of us could see. He set the phone down without a word, his expression returning to that same unreadable calm, and then he lifted his gaze again, not to me this time, but to the manager, and that single look was enough to make the man straighten instantly, like he had just received instructions without a single word being spoken. The manager nodded once, quickly, before turning away and disappearing toward the back of the restaurant, and I felt a quiet unease settle in. Not fear, not exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when you realize that the moment you thought was over is actually still unfolding in ways you do not yet understand. "Mom," my daughter's voice pulled me back, soft, curious, and I looked down at her, forcing my focus back to where it belonged. "Yes, sweetheart," I asked, keeping my tone light, steady. She hesitated for a second, then glanced toward the room, lowering her voice again. "Why is everyone acting different?" I paused, considering the question, the honesty of it, the way children notice things adults pretend not to see, and I chose my words carefully, not wanting to complicate something that did not need to be complicated for her. "Sometimes," I said gently, "people change when they realize they should have done better from the start." She nodded slowly, like she understood just enough, like that answer fit into the world she knew. And then she returned to her meal, content again in a way that made me both grateful and thoughtful at the same time. But as I sat there, watching her, listening to the quiet rhythm of the room that had shifted around us, I could not ignore the feeling that this was not the end of it, that whatever had begun the moment we walked in had not fully revealed itself yet, and somewhere behind me, without needing to turn, I knew the man who had asked a single question was still the one deciding how far this would go. The shift became undeniable when the music softened and then stopped entirely for a brief second. Not long enough for most people to question it, but long enough for everyone to notice, like the room itself had been gently paused, waiting for something to catch up with it. Conversations dipped, eyes lifted, and I felt it before I saw it, that quiet ripple of attention moving toward the front of the restaurant where the manager had disappeared just minutes ago. My daughter looked up from her plate, sensing it too, her fork hovering midair as she glanced around with the kind of curiosity only a child allows herself. "What is happening?" she whispered, and I shook my head slightly, though my own attention had already shifted, drawn toward the same unseen point. The manager reappeared, but he was not alone this time. Two other staff members followed closely behind him, both dressed more formally, both carrying themselves with a kind of careful urgency that did not belong to routine service. He stopped near the center of the room, just far enough to be seen by most of the guests, and cleared his throat quietly, though he did not raise his voice, did not need to, because the room was already listening. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone controlled but noticeably different, more deliberate than before. "We would like to take a moment to thank you for your patience this evening." The words felt rehearsed, but the timing did not, and I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the edge of the table as I tried to understand what this moment was becoming. He continued, choosing each word carefully. "Due to an internal matter regarding our service standards, we will be closing early tonight to ensure that we maintain the level of experience our guests deserve." A murmur spread through the room, soft but immediate, confusion layered with surprise, and I saw it in the faces around us. People trying to piece together what had changed. Why now? Why tonight? My daughter looked at me, her brows drawing together slightly. "Are we leaving?" she asked, her voice small again, uncertain in a way that made my chest tighten. "I do not think so," I said quietly, though I was no longer entirely sure of anything. The manager's gaze shifted then, not randomly, not generally, but with intention, moving across the room until it landed, unmistakably, on our table, and for a second, everything else seemed to fade again, the murmurs, the movement, the confusion, all of it narrowing into that single line of attention. "Except for one table," he added, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything before it, sharper, more defined, like the room itself had just been divided into before and after. I did not need to turn to know why, did not need to search for confirmation, because I could feel it already, that quiet, controlled presence behind it all, the same presence that had asked a single question and never raised his voice. My daughter's hand slipped into mine again, instinctive, seeking, and I held it gently, grounding both of us in a moment that had grown far beyond anything we had expected when we walked through those doors. Around us, people began to gather their things, some confused, some annoyed, some simply curious, but no one argued, no one pushed back, and that told me more than any explanation could have. This was not a request, not a suggestion, it was a decision, and as I sat there, watching the room reshape itself around that decision, I understood something with a clarity that settled deep and steady. Whatever power had entered this space tonight was not loud, not chaotic, but absolute in a way that did not need to announce itself, because everyone already knew to listen when it spoke. The room did not empty all at once, it unraveled slowly, like people were not entirely sure if they were supposed to leave, or if this was some kind of mistake that would correct itself if they just waited long enough. But no correction came. Only quiet confirmation in the way the staff moved with calm efficiency, guiding guests toward the exit with polite smiles that did not invite questions. Chairs shifted back, glasses were set down unfinished, conversations faded into hushed confusion, and through it all, no one challenged the decision, not openly, not directly, as if something unspoken had already made that option irrelevant. My daughter watched it happen with wide eyes, her earlier excitement replaced by a quiet kind of wonder, like she was witnessing something she did not yet have the words to describe. "They are all leaving," she whispered, leaning closer to me, her voice careful, almost reverent, and I nodded slowly, though my attention had already moved beyond the people standing up from their tables, beyond the soft shuffle of coats and footsteps, to the one person who had not moved at all. He remained exactly where he had been, unchanged by the shift he had created, his posture steady, his expression unreadable, like the outcome had never been in question for him. As the room continued to clear, the space around us grew larger, quieter, until the distance between tables no longer felt like separation but like intention, like everything had been rearranged to center on a single point without anyone announcing it. The manager approached our table again, but this time there was no hesitation in his steps, no uncertainty in his voice, only a controlled respect that had settled into place as if it had always belonged there. "Ma'am," he said carefully, his tone measured, "please take your time this evening. Anything you or your daughter would like will be provided." The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was not, and I could feel it, the weight of something larger than service, something closer to acknowledgement. I nodded once, not overly grateful, not dismissive, just steady, because this moment did not belong to him, and I think he understood that. He stepped back without another word, leaving us in a space that now felt impossibly quiet compared to before, the soft lighting stretching further across empty tables, the absence of noise making every small sound more noticeable, the gentle clink of my daughter's fork against her plate, the faint hum of the air, the steady rhythm of my own breathing. "Mom," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, thoughtful, "is this because of him?" I followed her gaze again, this time without hesitation, meeting the stillness across the room where he sat, and for the first time, he looked directly back at me, not for long, not in a way that demanded anything, but long enough to make something clear without a single word being spoken. "Yes," I answered quietly, not looking away, because somehow it felt right not to. She nodded, as if that confirmed something she had already begun to understand, and then she returned to her plate, content in a way that felt earned, not given. I held that moment for a second longer, that silent exchange across the room, and realized something that settled deeper than anything else that had happened tonight. He had not stepped in to impress, or to be seen, or even to be thanked. He had stepped in because he had decided something was wrong, and in his world, that was reason enough to change it. And as I lowered my gaze back to the table, I understood that whatever this was, whatever had started the moment we walked through those doors, it was not over yet, because people who move the world like that do not do it halfway. The last of the guests filtered out quietly, the door closing behind them with a soft finality that made the entire restaurant feel like a different world, no longer a place of noise and judgment, but something slower, more intentional, almost private in a way that did not belong to a public space. The staff moved with quiet precision now, resetting tables that no longer needed resetting, adjusting details that no longer mattered, all of it done with a kind of silent understanding that tonight was not business as usual and would not be again for a long time. My daughter leaned back slightly in her chair, her small hands resting on the edge of the table as she looked around, taking in the empty room with wide, thoughtful eyes. "It feels like we are the only people here," she said softly, and there was no fear in her voice, only wonder, the kind that turns moments into memories without asking permission. I smiled faintly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "For tonight, we are," I replied, and the truth of it settled between us in a way that felt both simple and impossible at the same time. I reached for my glass again, finally taking a sip, the water cool and steady, grounding me in a moment that still felt slightly unreal, like I was waiting for something to shift back, for the world to correct itself into something more familiar, but it did not. Instead, something else happened. A chair moved softly across the floor somewhere behind me, not loud, not abrupt, but enough to draw attention, enough to signal that the stillness had changed again, and before I could turn, I felt it, that same quiet awareness that had followed him all night, now closer, more present, no longer across the room but within it. "May I?" His voice came from just to my left, low, controlled, carrying the same calm certainty that had reshaped everything without ever needing to raise itself. I looked up, meeting his gaze fully for the first time without distance between us, and for a brief second, the rest of the room seemed to disappear again, not because of what he did, but because of how little he needed to do to command attention. "You can," I said, my voice steady, because somehow it felt important to meet him without hesitation, without shrinking, just as I had refused to do earlier. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down with deliberate ease, not invading, not imposing, simply present in a way that made space feel intentional rather than taken. Up close, there was something different about him, not softer, not less controlled, but more defined, like every detail had been chosen rather than inherited, from the way he held himself to the way his eyes observed without rushing to judgment. He glanced briefly at my daughter, offering a small nod that felt more respectful than performative. "You handled that well," he said, his attention returning to me, his tone even, not praise, not flattery, just recognition. I exhaled slowly, not realizing I had been holding that breath for longer than I thought. "I did not do anything," I replied, because it felt true, because walking away had been easier than staying. He shook his head slightly, almost imperceptibly. "You did," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less certain. "You left before they could decide your worth." The words settled deeper than I expected, not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they were accurate in a way that made them difficult to ignore. I looked down for a moment, then back up at him, holding that gaze a second longer this time. "And you decided to change that," I said, not as a question, but as an observation. He did not deny it, did not confirm it directly either, just held the silence in a way that answered more than words could have. After a moment, he leaned back slightly, his posture still composed, still controlled. "People remember how they are treated in places like this," he said, glancing briefly around the empty room. "Tonight, they will remember differently." I followed his gaze, taking in the space that had transformed so completely in such a short time, and I understood what he meant, not just for them, but for me, for my daughter, for the version of this night that would stay with us long after we left. "Thank you," I said finally, the words simple, but grounded in something real, not obligation, not expectation, just acknowledgement. He looked back at me, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something softer in his expression, not enough to change who he was, but enough to reveal that it existed. "Do not thank me," he replied quietly. "Just do not forget what it felt like to walk away first." And as I sat there, with my daughter beside me and the world momentarily still around us, I realized that this was not the kind of night that ended when the bill was paid or the lights went out. It was the kind that stayed, the kind that shifted something small but permanent inside you. Because sometimes the most powerful thing someone can do is not to give you a place at the table, but to remind you that you were never meant to ask for it in the first place.